Okay, good old quantitative versus qualitative. Again, quantitative is numeric or quantity, and then it assigns a numeric or monetary value or specific value. For example, if you know a server it's going to take $1,200 to replace a specific workstation or a specific device, that is something that you know for a fact that you should spend more than $5 on a fan system to keep that $1,200 item up and running. But again, you can tell exactly how much it's going to be worth because of the quantitative value. Qualitative, opinion-based, use of a rating system, and usually also scenario-based. Okay, qualitative steps of analysis. There's gather company experts, again, people from without the company. Again, your HR, your CFO type scenario. You go through, present the risk scenarios, rank seriousness of threats, rank countermeasures for those specific threats. And Delphi method is one of the popular ones to go through. It's anonymous input, so everybody basically puts in their own chart about how much they value the specific asset and what the risk associated with it is. And then if you do it anonymously, more people are probably going to be a lot more honest, but basically saying, again, HR, their internal users database is probably going to be the most, or one of the most important databases for them. If it lost, their entire group would be at a standstill for days or whatnot, as opposed to somebody from the financial side might say that the actual outside customer database is worth the most and so forth. And also helps ensure no intimidation, because a lot of people would say that, well, the internal users database isn't really worth much, so why are you giving it a 5 rather than a 3 or a 4? Okay, ALE, basically something you need to memorize for this test. ALE is basically the annualized loss expectancy. It goes through the mathematical equation of single loss expectancy, which is the SLE, which is the asset value times the exposure factor. Then also the ALE is the SLE times the annualized rate of occurrence. So if your server is going to go down, let's say due to fan going out, CPU overheating, it's $1,200 or $12,000 server, and it's going to cost you, say, for every time it does that, $5,000 in downtime due to not only work but all the expenses involved. What you're going to do is say that that might happen once every 2 years, and then what you're going to end up doing is have that to where it's 0.5 because it's going down to you're having it once every 2 years. If it's going to happen once every year, then you'd have it a full 2. So you'd have the value of it's going to be $5,000 in damages every time it goes down. If it happens twice a year, times it by 2, so now the ALE is $10,000. So you can spend up to $10,000 per year to protect the $12,000 asset. If you're only protecting that asset, it doesn't have anything on it, that $10,000 may no longer be worth your time in actually protecting the asset, so you may just take a hit on it, saying, well, I'm not going to do anything to protect it. So, but if it had $5 million worth of data on that hard drive, for example, then it's definitely worthwhile in spending the $10,000 per year to fix it. I've had one scenario. This organization, or a finger of the organization, was one of the southern states, and every once in a while their Havoc systems would go out. They'd have a problem with it, especially in the summertime. It'd get extremely hot, so the air conditioning, of course, would go out, and then usually within an hour or so, servers started failing. And then usually the servers would be down, or they would turn them off completely to minimize the actual hardware failure for a day or two, or until they finally were able to get the air conditioning back up and running. The bad part about it is they were the primary backup. So if the main site went out, if it just happened to be on the wrong day, there's a good possibility the whole organization could have been down. Okay, ALE. Values used basically helps categorize risk. The more damaging risks needs to be addressed first. And there's a lot of scenarios to where, for example, they have 1 through 5. 1 being the biggest risk or biggest problem, or category 1, and then the highest number being the lowest problem. And the benefit of doing, for example, a 1 through 5 or 1 through 3 scale, so you can have low, medium, and high, is that, again, going back to if the server goes down, that's going to be high risk. but the vulnerability or a specific item may be a low risk, so it averages out to a medium. But there could be a scenario to where, like a customer database specifically, may be vulnerable to SQL injection from the internet. Since that would be a high risk and a high exposure factor, and to my other items, that's going to be marked higher on the ALE or basically on the asset value than another item. Also helps determine the amount to spend on the countermeasure and helps create a security budget, assuming that you work in an organization that will give you a security budget. The ARO, these values and meanings, basically it's one time in a 12-month period, which would be the ARO of 1 year. If it's once every 10 years, it'd be 0.1. Once every 100, 0.01. For example, probably the best place to get a lot of these numbers would honestly be from an insurance company, because they have specialists that crunch the numbers and do this. And this is how they come up with the rates. For example, fire insurance. Insure a building, I believe the average is once every 30 years, the building is going to burn down. So if you protect yourself and spend per year for example, like a water system or anti-fire system or fire suppression system that is going to be the, say 80% or 65% of the value of the facility within that 30-year period of time, then it's usually going to lower your insurance. But what it's going to come down to, those are the numbers that they put in if you do not have any protection in place. And then, of course, they adjust the numbers so if you do have a protection in place. But yeah, if you have access to an insurance company and they communicate well with you, there's a good possibility you might get a lot of those numbers directly from them, which helps in the RO process. Because especially, for example, back in Montana, there are earthquakes every once in a while because it's so close to Yellowstone, but there's very rarely anything severe or anything that can really be felt by anybody. But if you're in California, that's going to be a big problem, is that there's more often large earthquakes in that area. So if you have a large, say, skyscraper, it's beneficial to make it where it sways a lot more than you would have to have, let's say, in Akron, Ohio or whatnot. Okay, can a purely quantitative analysis be accomplished? And of course the answer is no, because again, if you have a database that's relatively useless to the organization, but it's there, it may be worth a specific dollar amount, but if it's not generating profit or revenue, then even though on paper it's something you should secure, but in reality it's probably going to be very low on the totem pole. Okay, comparing cost and benefit. Okay, a cost, of course, is going to be in dollars, time to implement, and impact on operations. Again, the time to implement is going to be your man hours and that type of usage. Sometimes you have to get third-party providers to come in and reset up equipment or set up software. Then also impact on operations. Not only is it going to be the time, but the potential, again, like I mentioned before, the productivity of the individuals, because for the next year, they're going to be spending, say, 5% of their daily schedule trying to repair things that were broken at a specific incident. Okay, value of the countermeasure would be ALE without countermeasure minus ALE after countermeasure. If the cost of the countermeasure is basically equal to that, realized benefit savings. So if you have the countermeasure in place and it costs more than the actual A or the ALE of the item, then of course that's going to be a bad thing. So you want to keep it under that. And again, what I mentioned before, like the CISSP, there's also the CISM. With the CISM deals a lot more with this specifically, and they push more of the other costs involved. So that's one thing that you may come across is that, say your ALE in your mindset may only be, say, $20,000 for a $50,000 item, but there may be other things that the organization itself, from a business perspective, may also have to do with regulations and items, which could cost or make the ALE skyrocket. So that's another thing. It's a very good idea if you can get a good communications channel with the business owner, either, for example, like the C-level execs, or if you are one, the board of directors, because they're going to give you a better opinion or a better mindset of how the organization is run and some of the key factors for that organization. Okay, countermeasure criteria. Countermeasure should mitigate the identified risk and be cost effective, and mitigate it to an acceptable level. Because again, you can't do it 100% unless you eliminate the risk altogether, which means that you're no longer using the item that has a potential risk on it. For example, if you have Windows 98 on a few workstations, and you want to eliminate the risk of people getting physical access to the system by deleting the PWO files. You can either add countermeasures to it or eliminate it by taking that system out of the loop, either upgrading it to XP 2000 or just taking the system offline completely. So that would be the actual elimination of it. But other than that, there's no way to eliminate it. Okay, basically to get the countermeasure cost, it should be the ALE before implementing the countermeasure, minus the ALE after the countermeasure, minus the annual cost of the countermeasure. So another thing a lot of people forget is the maintenance fees. For example, if you have a support contract with an organization, it may be $100,000 to get the countermeasure in place, but then it's usually a third of that to a fifth of that every year for support. So it could be anywhere from, example, like the $20,000 to the $33,000 per year, just to keep up the phone lines if anything goes bad, saying what happened. And then a lot of times at the end of that 3 to 5 year support contract, you then have to pay again for the software to get the next version. So that's something that a lot of people fail to remember whenever putting countermeasures in there. They cost a lot more than usually think. Then also the analysts. So if you get an IDS implementation in your organization, it's definitely a good idea to have somebody look at the logs. I've had a scenario to where individual bought an IDS solution, plugged it into the network, and then didn't call anybody, didn't do anything else. And then when the assessment came, it's like, so how many intrusions have you had in the past 6 months? Go, we haven't had a single one. So of course, red flag comes up. Well, not even an attempt, no traffic whatsoever. So after looking at it further, the IDS wasn't set up. So it was turned on, it was running, but it wasn't logging anything, and there were no flags being hit. So as soon as it was turned on and configured, instantly traffic started going through the roof, that all these scans were happening. And of course, they weren't as happy as they were when they didn't know. But comes down to is that now they have to dedicate hours of an individual specifically to look for the log files in that aspect. I know some organizations will have 24/7 IDS analysts looking specifically for intrusions into the network. And they'll have two different forms. They'll have the analyst for the live attacks or live log analysis. Then they'll have historical views. So they'll have somebody going through looking at 1 month to 6 months of actual log analysis. The benefit of that, a lot of attackers will do what's called a slow and go attack. And the live individuals won't see that. Either A, it won't pop up on the IDSs, or it's like one connection every 5 minutes. It's not going to pop up on any of the live stuff. But somebody doing a historical analysis, which would be going through not only the IDSs, but the traffic logs and whatnot, like the net flow, west flow data, would actually see potentially a heartbeat, like once every 5 minutes, something hits. Could even be from different IP addresses I've seen, where somebody was doing a zombie attack and trying to scan the entire subnet range, but from a different IP. And you could tell it was human because the heartbeat, once every 5 minutes, a port would be connected to and a different one. But once you did the math all together, it came down to they were doing the full range port scan, and they were either bouncing it off of other IP addresses on the internet, or they had a bunch of zombies out there doing the same. And those are going to be your more dangerous individuals because they have a lot more technical knowledge, they have a lot more patience. And if they've been targeting you for 6 months, chances are if they find something, you're probably not going to see the attack. Rather than the script kiddies, whenever they're doing a full scan off Nmap or whatever port scanning utility they have, they're doing it in sane mode, which is their full system resources hitting yours. They pop up like a Christmas tree, lights on a Christmas tree. So those are the ones that the live analysts will see, and then the more dangerous ones are the historical. But again, that comes back down to the cost involved with it. Because that IDS and all the log monitoring, you may have spent, let's say, $250,000 on the hardware, the network architecture, the design. Now you're spending payroll for 15 people to look at the content, or 20 people. Okay, can you eliminate all risk? Of course, the option is to eliminate the asset. If the asset's no longer there, then technically yes. For the CISSP is concerned, that's not an option as far as the elimination of risk. So you cannot eliminate all risk. It's either again, you accept it, you mitigate it, or you transfer it. which basically means you find a scapegoat and then have them pay responsibility for it. Okay, total risk versus residual risk. The amount of risk that exists before the safeguard is in place is the total. Residual is what's left after the fact. Total risk equals threats times vulnerability times asset value. And then residual risk is times control gap. And then, for example, if you only have, let's say, 5% risk left over, and the control gap would be the 5%. So you still have X amount that you can play with. And a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll put in the one countermeasure, or they'll put in defense in depth. So you have one countermeasure, like a network level, that takes responsibility for a specific percentage of all the software vulnerabilities on their network. Because again, going back to the software development, I've seen a lot of organizations, they pay for the service for the team to build something for them, but they don't, either the organization or the client doesn't give them all the information that the development team needs, or they just don't put in the proper stuff, such as, again, like FIPS 140-2 is a encryption standard. So when it comes down to it, sometimes you may have to become standard for your CNA process and compliant for that by adding more technology in the loop. But again, the more there is, the more likely a failure is about to occur. Because, for example, back to coding, the average is about one bug every 1,000 lines of code when somebody writes it. And that's going to be without any testing. And of course, with testing, if you do code review, you're going to minimize that as well. But if you have a million lines of code, chances are you're going to have quite a few vulnerabilities out there, especially if you don't do the code analysis. Okay, response to identified risks. You want to mitigate the risk. Team presents an analysis results to management. Management makes a decision, and then basically the management has several choices when dealing with the risk. And with that being said, it's very beneficial for the countermeasures aspect for the people that did the analysis, the risk analysis, to give, again, a low level, a medium, and a high level countermeasure. Okay, you can accept the risk, which is carries out due diligence. It's an informed decision and better choice than not being found neglected. And then there's rejecting risk. This basically makes it to where you're not doing your due diligence, you're ignoring it, and then when it does happen. But again, like I said, in reality, if the individual is told about it, it's an automatically accepting. But for the test, it's accepting, rejecting, mitigating, and transferring. Okay, any questions so far? Okay. Okay, in this area, we're going to talk about good old employee issues. Of course, there's the enforcement of rules, there's the hiring and termination practices, and of course, the security awareness training. The good old enforcement of rules, that's definitely a fun one, because back to the due care and due diligence issue, a lot of times they'll go through enforcement, but it'll be different layers of enforcement, such as if it's a specific group, they may be targeted a little bit more strictly than other groups, especially, for example, like data entry in an organization versus a C-level exec or middle management. All three of those are probably going to be treated differently. But back to due care and due diligence, if you do treat them differently, then the organization's opening themselves up from an HR standpoint to potential lawsuits. For example, like wrongful discharge. Because there's, if you fire somebody for one thing and then their manager's doing the same thing, and if they don't get fired for it, they may just get talking to, or they have to go to specific training that says that you can't go to those type of sites on work hours, then it could come back to hurt the organization. Okay, security enforcement issues. Basically, it goes through, you want, again, to enforce it at a reliable level. Support directly from upper management. Because if upper management does not support it, again, it's going to fail. And a lot of the mindset for the test, per se, is going to be management buy-off. So if you do anything, it has to be signed off by management, senior management, preferably the owner of the system. For example, like the CIO, CEO, whoever is going to take ultimate responsibility for the network or for the security of the organization, those are the people that need to sign it. If you are the CIO or the CEO, then basically you have to go to the board of directors. And then if you're the board of directors, then you're either accepting it, rejecting it. But that's the main thing that they really want you to push for the CISSP, is it has to be from the top level down. Okay, ensure required baselines of security is met. Again, back to the example of certification and accreditation. Certifying it is going to make sure that the baseline is met. Basically, it's the contract of the security posture. It's saying that this is everything that we will be at or that we want to be at. And once you hit there, then it's quote-unquote certified. With that being said, whenever doing a risk analysis or risk management, what you're trying to do is look at your baseline, where you're supposed to be at, and seeing if there are any gaps. And then if there are any gaps, then you put either the acceptance, the transference, the mitigation in place to make sure that you are back at that gap. Some people will have different levels that they want to get to. So their CNA process has one level, for example, like the CMM. CMM's security analysis area, basically saying that at level 4 it's going to be managed, level 5 is going to be optimized. The majority of organizations shoot for 4 because that's showing that you're doing the majority of your due care and due diligence. Some organizations actually shoot for 5, which is going to be a lot more expensive, but their whole thing is they're going to be at the minimum of good, but they want to be better. So then they just keep doing their gap analysis through the risk assessment, risk analysis. But what it comes down to as well is again, the security enforcement issues, is the policies and procedures in that aspect. Whenever they find something that could be potentially damaging, they usually evolve the policies and procedures to take that into account to minimize that in the future. Also, realized ramifications of actions, which would be as if you have an acceptable use policy in place. If they break that acceptable use policy, they could be fired or flogged or whatever you want to do to them. I have had scenarios though, email specifically, to where there was an acceptable use policy for email that says only business email can be used within the corporate environment, and you can only use your business email for business uses, which makes sense. But then there's a loophole saying that if you want to read your personal email, which was against the rules and regulations, then what you ended up having to do is forward it to your business account. And then once you forward it to your business account, then you can read it. Therefore, that gave a reasonable expectation of privacy issue, which could potentially be used if somebody opened up their business email because there was personal email intertwined with the business. So that was a loophole that probably should not have been there. I have been in an environment where there was a zero tolerance policy. And the interesting case was basically everybody that went to inappropriate sites, and it was proven that it was definitely inappropriate and not quote-unquote artistic. So it ended up happening, the majority of people got fired. But then there was one individual that raised up the issue of, well, I was searching for my significant other. And the legal staff and HR didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole and basically put the guy through training. It's saying that there's probably some emotional issues there and let it slide. That was one of the scenarios because they did have a zero tolerance policy. Somebody could have come back and said, well, same thing happened to me and that's why I was looking for it. Or it's a sickness and so forth. So again, if you do not have it to where your policies and procedures are enforced equally, that could open yourself up for liability. Okay, employee management. Weakest link in security is definitely people. You could have an extremely secure perimeter. And what it comes down to is simply calling up an organization, pretending to be an employee, especially if you have an employee's first name, last name, and potentially some other sensitive information from that individual, and have their passwords reset. It's a very common, easy way thing to do, especially during social engineering attacks. I've had a lot of luck calling an organization, finding out a specific individual and their job function, and saying that I'm on the road at a hotel, I can't VPN, I could always VPN before, and then just start acting like you're getting frustrated. And usually if you can get in, for example, through the gatekeeper, and instead of going to your basic tech support, go in through the organization and then be transferred to the internal support. A lot of people, instead of taking the time to say this is an external call, and when it goes to the secondary individual, it pops up as being an external call. A lot of people forward it directly from their extension, and therefore it looks like it's an internal call. So there's also more inherent trust. So if you can get to the internal IT support or the quote-unquote protected support for the internal users, they're going to trust you because it's internal number coming from somebody who's internal on the Active Directory server or whatnot. So a lot of times I've been able to get in there, act aggravated. Most of the people do not have customer service hats. So what they want to do is get the person off the phone as quickly as possible, especially when they sound aggravated, and help them to basically keep them quiet. So again, the weakest link is going to be security. There's also a good test on the social engineering side as to where if you have a CD or have multiple CDs, you put them in the smoking areas, the cafeteria, or a place where a lot of people go, and then you put in, for example, like a magic marker, type in 2008 financials for January, or something very enticing. A lot of times people will grab the CD and then instantly put it into the disk drive just to see what it is, whose it is, what they can find out on it. And that simple curiosity issue for potential snooping, if you're doing a pen test, can easily take over the system. Okay, proper management of employees is definitely very important. Communication structure needs to be in place. Management structure needs to be in place. Constructing and enforcing acceptable usage policies. And of course, rotation of duties. And again, with the acceptable use policies, if you train people that they're not supposed to do specific actions, you're minimizing the potential for specific risks to be taken over by threats or whatnot, but you're still not mitigating it completely. Because a lot of people, even though they've been through training on, if I see an email, I probably shouldn't click on it if I don't know what it's from, are still probably going to do it. You're just making it more aware, so when they see specific key indicators, they're probably not going to do it. For example, I'll bring up this text, create some space here. This right here is something that if, let's say, www.attacker.com / about ASP, and then whatever variable. So somebody's looking for specific passwords. You might be able to train individuals to say that this is a very bad link. If it's not from the internal company, do not click on the link, especially if they say to reset your passwords. However, if an attacker finds a vulnerability like a cross-site scripting vulnerability on somebody's website, they may be able to find that's the target organization. Since they trust the organization inherently because they work there, it may actually have some sort of a page. A lot of times it's like a search page, whatnot. And then you'll have actual cross-site scripting content. What's the funny part about it is a lot of people will see that it's coming from their website. There's two things wrong with that. For one thing, they're probably going to inherently trust it because, again, that's going to be a spear phishing attack. It's coming from their website. It's probably correct. At least that's the training they see. The other issue, a lot of organizations have subdomains, for example, like payroll.hackmehamattarget.com. So what they'll end up doing is they'll trust their entire domain inherently. So basically their domain name.com is going to be at the trusted level, which means that all scripts within the trusted level are going to run. So if somebody's doing a targeted attack, they're going to be able to run dangerous scripts such as let's alter registry keys, let's download files, run programs, all because they trust inherently their own domain. So that's one of the reasons why spear phishing is so dangerous, is because you're targeting individuals on their own information. So that's one way that you can do a social engineering attack, and you can train people to look at the content. Some of the bad parts, however, are I've seen a lot of content management systems or websites that will have extremely long links. So when you look at the link, it's, for example, like 4 or 5 lines long, mainly because they're going to a subfolder and then bouncing from that subfolder into another file that could be on a different server. So people are more likely to click on dangerous links because now they're being trained that long links are realistic, long links are common. So that's one problem. Another problem, assuming that hackmeinc.com is the target, there's an issue which was recently fixed in IE, or not fixed, but blocked out from IE, but this is an old RFC standard. We have username, :password, knowing that search.php is a valid file, and then what they would end up doing is the @, the server. So this link down here does what this does. Except when people see it, again, they're going to see their own domain name. A lot of times they see the double dots as actually being a slash as opposed to the colon. And then the same thing as well, the @sign. A lot of times they mistake the @sign as a question mark. So there's lots of ways to obfuscate items. And another way people say, well, it wasn't a website, it wasn't an IP address, but this right here is actually an IP address. You can prove that by going down to Start, Run CMD. You ping this number, and it translates to 186.200.242.9. So that's a way to obfuscate the information. Again, the more training you have for the individuals, the less likely they're able to fall for a lot of these things. But when it comes down to it, if they're not trained, or even if they are trained, a lot of the complicated attacks are going to be relatively close to what's reality, and they'll still be able to fall for it. So going back to, again, the 80-20 rule, you can prevent a lot of the things from happening, some of the basic attacks, but if they get more advanced and targeted, then it's going to take a little bit more than training to prevent. And of course, rotation of duties, because if somebody's in a specific area long enough, they may become lax. Some of the security things that they do may also become lax and potentially open up doors. Okay, importance of security. Why would pre-employment and termination steps be important to a securities program or company security program? Anybody have a theory on that? Why you'd want to do any sort of pre or post-employment processes?
Sure, passwords get changed.
Yep. Passwords being changed, accounts not to be deleted, but to be disabled. Because if they have any sort of encryption on the system, the files are no longer accessible if you delete them. But if you disable them, you can still get back to the data. The pre-employment, good old background checks. So if you go through, and if you're a financial organization, it's a very good idea to know if the person has been convicted of embezzlement. Because if they have, if anything happens in the future, especially with that individual, then it could come back to haunt you, especially in civil cases. Okay, firing issues. I've a lot of issues with relieving somebody of duty. For example, complete an exit interview. A lot of times, just asking a person, social engineering them basically, they'll reveal a lot of things that they may have done which are inappropriate on the network. For example, through the exit interview, if you ask the right questions, you may be able to elicit that the guy put a back door on there, or some sort of time bomb or logic bomb. Basically, a time bomb or a logic bomb would come down to, say, a programmer or an administrator runs a script, and let's say once a month this script runs, it looks for a condition. Once it runs, it changes the condition to a negative, such as, let's say, a file's there, or a specific value in a database is there. Once it runs the next time, if that condition is not met, then it starts doing strange things, like either altering data, deleting data, trying to wipe a hard drive or different disks or whatnot. And a lot of these people will see this as quote-unquote job security. So if they do anything to me, they're going to be sorry in the end. What's funny, the majority of logic bombs that I've found have been failures. They've been written by a programmer or whatnot, but they didn't actually test it. So they wrote the code, but when it runs, it actually didn't either have the right access rights to do anything, or it went through and it just didn't hit the right folders. There's an individual must be immediately escorted out of the facility. And usually they want somebody from HR, potentially physical security as well, so not just the information security individual. Individuals must surrender ID badges, keys, company assets. Again, with the keys, because they can easily be reproduced, and ID badges can also be easily reproduced. For anybody that's done a business case on creating organization IDs, probably has come across a lot of printers and, let's say, not only barcode printers, but the magnetic strip read writers. You can get an ID badge system, which does the printing in color, and it does the magnetic strip writing for probably about $1,200 or so. So it's relatively easy. And each card you can actually reproduce for a couple bucks here and there. But again, if they have the capability for that, then they can make the fake badge or reproduce their own badge. So when it gets taken out, it can be used again. And that's another reason why the accounts need to be disabled. So that badge is no longer valid. CAC, how many people deal with that? Common access cards. I know that there's an initiative trying to make driver's licenses CACs as well. So it's going to be your universal ID card as opposed to just your normal thing. Same thing with a lot of organizations. Instead of having two IDs, one to get into the geographic area and then a CAC to log onto the system, they're trying to make that a universal card as well. Okay, also passwords must be changed. So not only do you disable the account, change the password. I've had a lot of instances to where system administrators, this is the best one, would leave an organization, and they would usually create several accounts for troubleshooting purposes or whatever they had in mind, and they would come back to the organization 2 to 3 years later, and they'd still be able to log in with those usernames and passwords. Every once in a while, even their old real username, but usually those have a policy where they get changed every 30 to 90 days. But again, validating the users that are on the network, and then basically making sure that they're associated with a real legitimate user, definitely important. Then unfriendly termination. Disable accounts and passwords immediately as opposed to at the end of the day or whatnot. So, any questions on that domain, security management practices? One thing it is definitely important for a lot of organizations, again, back to the hiring and firing clause, is that the go background check. I know there's a lot of organizations that do that commercially, so you can actually hire somebody else to go through the entire process, which could just be your basic criminal records, which are usually going to be public information. So like FBI background checks, all the way to interview checks. So not only do you do the criminal investigation, you interview family members, things like that. So depending on the investigation process, it can definitely go quite in depth.